Okay, I think we're going to get going. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wilson Center. I'm Dave Rajewski, and I direct the Science Innovation Technology Program. And we're here today to talk about this report from Friends of the Earth, the International Center for Technology Assessment, and ETC on the principles for the oversight of synthetic biology. Whenever one of these reports come out, I always think about the scenes in the action movies where the grenade goes through the window, and people don't know quite how to react to it. It's sort of like, this is a scary thing, or maybe it's a dud. Maybe nothing's going to happen if I don't do anything. Things will be fine. And I think that misses the point of the actual need to kind of unpack the report and actually see what's inside of it. Because I think people either don't react or they overreact. And I think when these reports come out, they come out for a purpose. It's important to think about why this report came out at this point in time. What was driving this to happen? Has it happened before? There are other reports that have come out of the NGO community that are similar. How we responded to them in terms of business response, government response, I would say social response. So I think it's worth going through the exercise of just taking the report and taking a really close look at what's in it. And so Eric Hoffman from Friends of the Earth is here, and J.D. Hansen from the Center for Technology Assessment. And they're going to walk us through the report and try to sort of take the recommendations a little apart, I hope, and just kind of dig into them a little bit in terms of what's behind them. And then on the phone, we have Drew Endy from Stanford University. Drew's in Buenos Aires right now. But he definitely wanted to be here and make some comments on the report from the standpoint of somebody who's doing synthetic biology research and has been in the field for a while. And then I've asked Mark Greenwood to come and join us and also make some comments. Mark is a partner at Ropes and Gray, but he also spent 16 years at EPA and directed the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxic Substances, which would play a role in any kind of synthetic biology, or I would imagine most synthetic biology scenarios. So I think we've got an interesting side of agenda lined up. We're going to start with J.D., go from J.D. to Eric, and then Drew's going to join us and have some comments remotely here, and then Mark will make his comments, and then we'll have a discussion. So J.D., why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you, and good afternoon or good morning if you're listening from outside this area. I'm going to discuss first one principle, actually the first principle that we're looking at, the precautionary principle, and unpack that more. It's interesting, how any use of the precautionary principle is perceived currently in U.S. politics versus outside the U.S., I would say. We have 100 and... Okay, right here. Great.
I'm assuming, is this set up for PowerPoint?
Great. Thank you, Eric. The broad definition that we chose to use after consulting back and forth between different groups is one that was developed in 1998 by the Wing Spread Consensus Statement folks, coordinated by the Science and Environmental Health Network. It defines precautionary principle as when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. In this context, the proponent of an activity, rather than the public, should bear the burden of proof. The process of applying the precautionary principle must be open, informed, and democratic, and must include potentially affected parties. It must also, and this may be even the most important part of it, it must also include an examination of the full range of alternatives, including taking no action. Let's see. Okay. Well, the precautionary principle, broadly speaking, is not new. Probably the first application of it was from the Greek physician Hippocrates, who said, first, do no harm. And it has been integrated into a number of UN treaties. Some of these the United States has signed and ratified, some it has not. But the Carnegie Protocol on Biosafety is particularly relevant to the discussion of synthetic biology. The Convention on Climate Change is also quite relevant. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. The London Convention on Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping Waste and Other Matters into the Ocean. And the Convention on the Law of the Sea, fisheries provisions from 1982. The United States has not signed, actually the United States has signed but not ratified that treaty. But phrased another way, precautionary principle is a part of a number of U.S. laws. The basic legislation setting up the Food and Drug Administration requires all new drugs to be tested before they're put on the market. The phrase patent medicine is pejorative because it was untested medicine stuck on the market. We decided that wasn't a good way to do medicine and required drugs be tested before they got on the market. That doesn't always mean they don't have to be taken off the market, but at least you've made a good effort. The Food Quality Protection Act of 1996 requires pesticides to be proven safe for children or removed from the market, and several are being phased out or have been phased out. The National Environmental Policy Act doesn't necessarily prevent an agency from doing something, but it requires the agency to take foresight, to pay attention to consequences by requiring an environmental impact assessment for all federally funded projects. And it mandates consideration of alternative plans. NEPA is probably one of our best national examples of precautionary action, and our sister organization, the Center for Food Safety, has used it rather successfully to get the Department of Agriculture to do more careful reviews of genetically modified food crops. The Wilderness Act sets aside certain areas as non-violable. One of the earliest examples actually is the National Safety and Health Act, which imposes a general duty on employers to provide safe working conditions and workplaces. The Endangered Species Act sets the goal of protecting biodiversity. The Clean Water Act establishes strict goals to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And finally, the Clean Air Act requires standards to be set to protect the most vulnerable populations. I go through this in part to address, the assumption I hear in some discussions is, oh, this precautionary principle, it's just this European idea. It's really not. It's an idea that's been around for a long time, and it really will help us make better decisions, because precaution means wiser decisions. Now, we've called for a moratorium on the commercial aspects of synthetic biology until the principles that we've outlined have been put in place. But the precautionary principle is not to be seen primarily as a way to ban or to put on a permanent moratorium. it doesn't really work as a principle if that's its only purpose. Sometimes precautionary principle does result in a ban. I live in Arlington, Virginia. One of my neighbors found a Mexican rattlesnake in his garage. They're not native to Arlington, Virginia. It turns out his next door neighbor was breeding these things and many other poisonous snakes. And Arlington had not taken the precaution of having a law that banned the breeding of rattlesnakes in residential areas. It now has a ban. That's a good precaution, but it's not the only result that should come from a precautionary principle. The precautionary principle should encourage us to explore alternatives. It must place the burden of proof on the proponents of an activity rather than on the victims or potential victims of the activity or the federal agencies. We've had a really hard time in some aspects of federal environmental law. I mean, we still don't have some things banned because the standard of proof is so high for the federal agency. The standard of proof ought to be on the chemical company or the biological company that wants to do the activity rather than those of us who will breathe the product or consume the product. It needs to set goals that work to protect health and the environment. It needs to make sure that there are democratic ways that the public can participate. That's not like what the FDA generally does with a 3-minute public comment period at the end of some decision-making period. That's not a democratic process. That's a chance for a few people to make a statement for 3 minutes. It needs to bring transparency to decisions regarding health and the environment. Why does synthetic biology need a precautionary approach? Well, there are several reasons. One is that so far the organisms developed using synthetic biology techniques may be unpredictable. Genetic engineering with synthetic biology techniques may make unintended permanent changes in genomes, including the human genome. Turns out that, the Venter Institute did a really interesting job of getting one small organism to accept the DNA of another one. Bacteria have been doing this on their own for a really long time. And we need to make sure that as we develop this technology, that we are not spreading these new organisms unintentionally or this new DNA unintentionally throughout the natural world. There are a number of other ways that synthetic biology is not all predictable, and I imagine Drew will comment on these points. The synthetic biology parts are not all well characterized yet. Their genetic circuits are still unpredictable. Even work in single-cell organisms is very difficult. And as we start working on organisms larger, it might be even more difficult. So far, there are unexpected responses when some of the parts are put together. And an example of how complicated it might be is that the Venter Lab experiment was delayed for some time by essentially the synthetic biology equivalent of a typing error. And it means that this is not something that we know everything there is to know about. not something that we know will only have good results, and so we need to take precautions. Synthetic biology is not just one thing. So there will need to be different ways to do a precautionary review. The human and drug applications and the animal drug too will go through an FDA review. That's been hard to understand some of the problems they've had with traditional genetic engineering. And a friend of mine is a scientist over there trying to unpack what some of those problems are of traditional genetically engineered drugs not having the results. So the FDA is going to have more work to do with synthetic biology. Biofuels projects using algae especially, I think, need to be reviewed as though they are an invasive species. The algae produce some 40% of the oxygen of the planet. We are having some serious dialogue about problems with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We don't accidentally want to mess up that oxygen balance too. Another reason why we need to take a more precautionary approach with synthetic biology is much synthetic biology research is publicly funded. The Department of Energy and Department of Agriculture, National Science Foundation are the big funders in this field. Sometimes it's direct grants, sometimes it's loan guarantees, but it's our money. The public expects good oversight. If you think the public doesn't expect good oversight, this week talked to the GSA about oversight of just parties for employees, much less oversight of something that can change the ecology significantly. Unfortunately, research on a precautionary approach is not being well funded. The Department of Energy even tried to get a categorical exemption for its work in this area until a few of us complained that that might not be such a good idea. The National Science Foundation has funded lots of programs, but only about a dozen of them look at the precautionary issues involved. Actually, the Wilson Center is one of that dozen grantees, but it's not robust. When you've got something like 696 projects funded to do synthetic biology by the National Science Foundation and 12 to look at the effects, that's an unbalanced approach that suggests we're not yet looking at the precautionary approach. We need pre-market safety testing and review. And that should be for even the Department of Defense contracts. You should not be able to sidestep market testing, safety reviews, just because you're selling your biofuel to the Navy or someplace else. Monitoring and tracking technology must be a part of the approval process. The FDA actually, while we've criticized them on their genetically engineered animal process, at least they require the company wanting to get approval for a genetically engineered animal to present how we would in the real world tell whether their animal was a genetically engineered one or not, and give us the construct and how to detect it in the field. that same approach should be used for synthetic biology. Many times, people will say, well, we don't need any more regulation. In fact, the President's Commission report said this, because the coordinated framework for biotechnology is working just fine. Thank you. I can't think of another area where we have such a radical new technology that folks would say, oh, well, something that was developed back in the Reagan White House in 1984 anticipates everything we could possibly think about in this field. The coordinated framework, assumes that existing law pre-1984 was good enough to handle this, that no additional regulations are needed. To be fair to some of the agencies, some of them have tried to put out guidances that address some of these things or to tweak the way they do it. But, it's not working well for genetically engineered animals. Friends of the Earth has been working on genetically engineered mosquitoes, and it really is not working well for genetically engineered mosquitoes. It seems that the public health authorities of Key West, Florida, are our main regulators, not the government, and it won't work well for many of the synthetic biologies. The coordinated framework has led us to a problem with our trading partners with genetically modified foods. We don't really want to revisit that with synthetic biologies. We should probably find a way to regulate that lets everybody in the world be on something of the same playing field. I would suggest that we actually go ahead and license synthetic biologists or students that are working in this field. We license lawyers, we license doctors, we license tattoo parlors. In Virginia, to open a practice as someone doing tattoos, you've got to have 2 years of supervised care before you can go out and start needling anyone on your own. We should have that for synthetic biology students at least, and maybe their professors. And it shouldn't be, we don't tell the tattoo parlor industry, oh, it's fine, you guys can monitor yourself. You're the guys that know what tattoo artists should be, so we'll just have you be self-monitored. We don't do it for that. We shouldn't do it for synthetic biology. We need greater oversight of the pathogens being synthetically engineered, be they cholera or flu viruses or polio. We think that all projects that have potential to change the genome of animals need special oversight beyond anything now. We would also support, as a precautionary measure, private bonding of projects. Basically, if the private sector thinks it's too risky, maybe the government should too. I'm now at the end of my slides, and I need to turn it over to Eric, who will go through the other principles. Thank you, Eric.
Cool, and thank you, JD, and special thanks to Dave and Todd for organizing the event, and for everyone for coming out today, and thanks to Mark and Drew for taking the time to come out and join the panel, especially Drew, since it sounds like you're in a much prettier place than DC. You mind pulling up my slides? Cool. So I'm going to go a bit more detailed into the actual document, the principles for the oversight of synthetic biology. I think JD did a good job. Yes, the one right next to yours. Did a good job going giving a background on the precautionary principle and why we think it should be used around synthetic biology. And here's going to be kind of a view of how we think that, what that actually looks like a bit more. Do you mind turning it on? Go into slideshow up top. No?
Slideshow up top. I just added an extra slide. You didn't
No
want
worries,
that.
I'll skip it.
Here, you go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay.
Oh, right here, I see it.
Yeah, and then
Okay. Great.
cool. That's the extra slide, and then just a quick background. We released this document about a month ago. It was mid-March, and to date, it's been endorsed by 113 organizations from around the world. This is a broad spectrum of groups from civil society, social movements, religious organizations, scientist organizations, labor groups. There's a whole list, and in the back 2 pages, you'll see the current list of endorsers. To answer, I guess, Dave's question of why we did this and now, the groups that we were talking to and the authors of the report really felt that we need to respond to 2 main things. One is what we saw as a lack of regulation around this emerging technology that's growing quite rapidly, and as we see it, the laws are getting more and more outdated every day. And then the second one is just industry and government calls for self-regulation. And I'll get into a bit more why we think that's inadequate. So here are the 7 principles, which I'll go into in depth to each one more. So start again, the precautionary principle. As JD mentioned, how we see that applying to synthetic biology today is that we need a moratorium on the release and commercial use of synthetic organisms until a couple of things have happened. And those things are listed: the development of a true public interest research agenda, alternatives to synthetic biology have been considered, full and independent assessments of the environmental, human health, socioeconomic risks have been conducted, and strategies to mitigate or prevent identified harms. And until we have proper federal and international laws on the books to actually deal with the novel risks posed by synthetic biology, and laws that are actually flexible enough to keep pace with developments as the technology develops. And I think it's important to note that we're not calling for a ban on synthetic biology. I think all the signatories would agree that there could be some really useful applications of synthetic biology, particularly in terms of gaining better understanding of how genes, biological systems actually work. But right now, we need to put the brakes on because the technology is developing so rapidly. The second one is to require mandatory synthetic biology specific regulations. As JD mentioned, the coordinated framework is, in our opinion, outdated and inadequate to deal with the novel risks posed. In the U.S., we only have 1 regulation on the books that specifically deals with synthetic biology, and that's for DNA synthesis companies to identify possible orders that could be used to create something on the select agents list. I think it's a good regulation, but it's voluntary. Maybe something like that could become mandatory, which I think would be probably a good idea, but that's the only one we have, the only regulation we have in the U.S. that specifically deals with synthetic biology, and we think that that's not enough, and nor is self-regulation enough. I mean, there is a role for self-regulation, but that shouldn't replace actual governance from both local, national, and federal governments. We think self-regulation doesn't allow for proper public oversight or participation. It limits transparency, and there's no legal recourse in case something does go wrong, which actual laws and regulations would give you. The third is to protect public health and workers. And I think the main point in this principle that we were trying to highlight is that any potential exposures to humans from synthetic organisms must be assessed, and those organisms should be proven safe to humans before direct contact is actually made, or as best as possible. We focus a lot on workers' health and workers' rights because we really see biotechnology workers at the front lines of a lot of these risks. If a worker gets sick in a lab, and we work with a number of people who've gotten sick in biotech labs, if they get sick and they go home, the worker's not just putting herself at risk, but her family and her community. And if we can make sure we're protecting the workers in the lab, we're going to be a lot closer to actually protecting local communities from possible risks as well in terms of public health risks. And the one thing that we actually do call for a ban on in the report, because the rest we're just saying a moratorium for now until X, Y, and Z, we did call for a ban on efforts to actually change the human genome or the microbiome or epigenome or other parts of the human genome. We think that it just raises too many ethical and medical concerns that probably are too serious to actually deal with, at least at this time. And we can get into that later if folks want to. The next is to protect the environment. And we think in order to do this, there needs to be strong levels of containment at 3 different types of containment. That's physical containment, so your typical actual laboratory ways to keep things from getting out, biological containment, to make sure that if you're raising organisms, a certain type of organism, it won't have wild-type relatives right outside, possibly, if it's an algae or something else, and geographic containment. So what that would mean to us is you wouldn't build a major synthetic biology lab on a major earthquake fault, which is what's happening right now in Berkeley, where a lot of the synthetic biology research is happening. Right now, on part of the Ring of Fire, it's going to be one of the world's largest synthetic biology labs. And to us, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You should actually try to limit those types of potential exposures. Protecting the environment would also mean that you need independent risk assessments for each proposed activity or product that comes out of synthetic biology. And part of that assessment needs to look at the capacity of each synthetic organism to survive and reproduce in the wild, but also to look at the fate of its DNA in the environment. Because even if the organism dies out in the environment, it's possible the genes could still get picked up by wild-type organisms. Most of the work being done in synthetic biology is on yeast, E. coli, algae, viruses, and these things swap genes all the time. That's what they do. And so we need to actually study the fate of that DNA, which hasn't been done yet. Next is guarantee the right to know and public participation. As JD mentioned, it's not enough just to have a public comment period where the public has a couple minutes to comment. And it's not enough to go to the public and say, hey, we have this product, tell us what you think about it, and then you release it on the market a couple months later. We think the public needs to be involved from the decision making from the beginning, going all the way back to what type of research should happen. What type of products do we even want to look into developing? The public should have a say if they want a certain type of synthetic biology to continue or not. And along with that, they should have the right and the ability to actually stop projects that they see are dangerous if they're happening in their communities. And then part of all that is that I think synthetic organisms and their products should be labeled. This is a problem we're seeing right now with genetically engineered crops already. We think we should actually just use some foresight and make sure these things are labeled, the organisms in the lab and the products on the market, to track, to make sure, so you know where the organisms are, you know if the organisms escape, and if their products are on the market, you can test to make sure that there are no harms after products have already been marketed. JD was hinting at this too, but those that are doing synthetic biology should be legally and financially liable for any harms that might come out of their work to the public, to public health or the environment. And as JD was hinting, if the risks are too great for private investors, then those risks shouldn't be picked up by the public through things such as loan guarantees or building a 300-acre open pond synthetic algae farm a couple miles away from the New Mexico border. The public shouldn't be paying for risky projects like that if they can't get private funds on their own even. And then the last one, sorry, I'm trying to go through these quickly so we have enough time to actually have discussions and you can read through, and happy to debate and go in a bit further, but is protect economic and environmental justice. I think synthetic biology poses some new challenges in this area around issues around socio and economic justice that are either similar to issues that we're currently facing today or even can exacerbate some problems. And so I give 3 examples of what that might be. I think folks have heard us talk a lot about the new bioeconomy. And synthetic biologists promise that we're going to be able to replace oil and petroleum from our economy with biomass. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to tailor synthetic bugs to break down biomass to produce different products, from our biofuels to our plastics to our industrial chemicals, our oils that go into our cosmetics. And they say that we're going to have this new bioeconomy that's going to be clean and green. The problem is we don't have unlimited sources of biomass on the planet. Actually, about 86% of the world's biomass is found in the global south, in the tropical regions of the globe. And a lot of those communities are already living in poverty. A lot of that land is already dedicated to agriculture, and we know that land, water, and fertilizers are already in short supply for food production. And so one major concern is if we start shifting to this biomass economy, what are the socioeconomic implications going to be for those communities? Are we going to start seeing land dedicated to agriculture shifting to producing high-end cosmetic oils and high-end industrial chemicals for the US and Europe? Another set of issues would be natural product replacement. Synthetic biology right now is producing what was previously produced naturally or botanically, products such as artemisinin, the antimalarial from Amyris Biotechnologies, vanilla, rubber, stevia. The list actually goes on and on. More and more of these natural botanical products are being produced in synthetic biology vats instead of actually on farms or places in these communities whose livelihoods often depend on these products, again, largely in the global south. And the concern is, what are the economic implications going to be for those communities that depend on these products? And then last are issues around patents and biopiracy. There have already been some pretty broad patents granted on synthetic biology, whether it's DNA sequences or biological processes that are either mimic or mirror or just very small tweaks on naturally occurring DNA sequences or processes, and we think that's problematic. And then also, lastly, with biopiracy, and this is an issue that has come up a little bit at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the Cartagena Protocol. I guess the old form of biopiracy was, you would have folks go in, they would take biological material plants out of the country with them, and then they would produce products, largely pharmaceuticals and other things. But with synthetic biology, we're going to see a world where you can go take the DNA sample of a plant, send it through email, and then start producing that compound or whatever it is you want in a vat. And there actually is no transfer of biological materials, which means it actually goes around the international laws we have right now around biopiracy. So there's some serious concerns around digital biopiracy as well. And so that is my very quick review of the 7 principles. I'm really excited to hear the responders and then kind of our discussion afterwards. So thank you so much.
Okay, Drew? He's still there.
Dave, that was to me, just to double check.
Yeah, you're on.
Hey, can you hear me okay for the song?
Yeah, no, it's fine. We've got an amplifier right above it, so everybody can hear you. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Dave, and in particular to you and the Wilson Center for creating a venue that allows this conversation to take place. I think simply having the conversation is remarkable and difficult to do, and so I'm very grateful for that. Also to JD and Eric for their remarks and summary comments on the principles for the Oversight technology document that was released recently. I thought that what I might contribute really briefly would be some perspectives as one person from the synthetic biology research community. I don't speak or certainly cannot control most of what's happening in synthetic biology, so you have to take everything I say with that conditional. The first one I guess I would like to respond to is the idea that the precautionary principle should be employed for synthetic biology. And I don't have much to say about that at a high level because I feel that, at least based on what I know and listening to what JD had to say, there's a lot of battle over language, and I'm much more interested in specifics. I don't know whether or not what the Presidential Commission says in terms of prudent vigilance versus what I heard JD say in terms of precautionary principle, how far apart those actually are. I also, then when I get into the details of the principles document, find questions that are curiosities and important to me. So, for example, there's a call in this section on moratorium on the release and commercial use of synthetic organisms, cells, or genomes. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means a synthesized piece of DNA within an organism, or a synthesized genome within a natural organism, or a synthesized genome in something else. And I don't mean to become esoteric and technical, but to give a reason for why these details matter, it's not a surprise, but just to bring it forward, it's an issue for all of us to think about. The team decades ago that won the research competition, if you will, to synthesize human insulin in bacteria, won that competition because they used synthesis of DNA, de novo synthesis in a very primitive form, to make the gene encoding human insulin. So I'm wondering, as an example, whether or not what's asked for here in number 1 would lead to a retroactive ban on recombinant insulin production. I'm sure that's not what's intended, but just to bring forward a question. As another comment regarding precautionary principle, I was struck by, again, in listening to JP's remarks, how some of those ideas might relate or may not relate to what was developed within the so-called SPINK report, where they find what they called experiments of concern. And experiments of concern were activities that should immediately trigger review and maybe shouldn't be done, if at all. Mostly these have to do with issues of safety and human health. So an experiment of concern would be something that would confer resistance to a therapeutically useful antibiotic to an organism, would increase transmissibility of the pathogen, and so on. And I was curious, just again in listening, whether or not there could be a reprise of this framework more focused on environmental topics that could be useful. So I don't know how to react to the label precautionary principle. I don't really like to get caught up in the politics of it. And I find that there's a lot of interesting ideas and a lot of important details when one tries to react to what's proposed. Let me just leave that and give a reaction to a couple more of these points. Why are mandatory synthetic biology-specific regulations? Sounds good to me. There's a mention about the federal guidelines around having been one of the architects of that, sort of ahead of when it got codified at the federal level. I can go into details for how that's being based by ongoing advanced technology. I think one of the things here, which is going to be a trick for anybody, if you want to have practical regulation, is to think about a framework for regulation that moves quickly now. Because what we do right now within our regulatory frameworks is not keeping pace with what the technology is actually capable of doing. And I worry about a failure mode in which, by insisting upon very formalized, all-inclusive regulatory process, you're going to end up with regulations that are 5 years too late, too little. I would note in passing to Eric that the recombinant DNA guidelines have also been updated to deal with synthesis of DNA as it might apply to research systems. Regarding JD's comments about licensing, as somebody who trained as a civil engineer and worked for Amtrak for a while, very familiar with professional engineering licenses. I think the big difference in moving into the world of biology is biotechnology derives initially from science and medicine. While medicine has licensing, the field of biology as a science hasn't. And so it's a cultural transition, perhaps, to figure out how to work through. It would, for example, for me, be very easy to, and I have advocated for licensing. I would probably say that licensing shouldn't apply to students and academics, but to professionals who are doing work that would be released and potentially would impact the public or the environment. I would note that, again, using the professional engineering disciplines as an example here, the licensing framework is self-applied and self-regulated with failures, accidents, if you will, bring additional attention and liability. So more to talk about there, but you know, as a comment regarding licenses, I think that's a neat idea. One of the things I would point everyone's attention to is a document called a quote-unquote concise guide to regulation and governance in synthetic biology as it applies to synthetic biology at a website called synbrc.org/practices. synbrc.org/practices. At the bottom of that site, you download a document that's longer than the principles for oversight. If that means anything, it doesn't. But it's got about 30 pages summarizing an analysis of how existing governance frameworks apply or do not apply to synthetic biology. And I guess what I want to highlight from this is what I would consider to be a mistake in representing or imagining that synthetic biology is an ab initio reinvention of biotechnology. It is deeply integrated into the past history of recombinant DNA, for better or worse. Yet as we develop new tools, we need to figure out what to do. And so I don't think it's productive to start from a position of imagining or representing that everything new is happening. We've got to figure out how to deal with this. When the reality is there's a bunch of stuff already in place that may be imperfect, probably almost certainly is, it'd be surprising otherwise. We have to figure out how to make it better. I would really appreciate an opportunity to see, for example, the principles for the oversight of synthetic biology documents be reconciled with the current government framework to figure out where the gaps are, what it would look like if one wanted to fill those gaps, and so on. Because I think, again, the details matter quite a bit. On the topic 3, protect the public health and worker safety, one of the detailed comments there that caught my attention was following. It says, it reads, the use of synthetic biology to change human genetic makeup, including the genome, the epigenome, and the microbiome, must be prohibited. So this triggered many questions for me, not because, although I'm accused of representing this, I find it a curiosity, that we could rebuild human beings, but because, as an example of an application of synthetic biology already demonstrated, people have been making attenuated vaccine candidates by taking virus genomes, and instead of synthesizing and releasing pathogens, what they're doing is they're de-optimizing the capacity of the virus to express its genes, yet preserving the immunogenic properties of the virus particle perfectly. And they do this by making hundreds of mutations, each of which create a slight defect in the fitness of the virus. It's a very interesting approach to attenuated vaccine development because it means that no single mutation in a manufacturing process is likely to restore full infectivity, which means that the leaking through of fully infectious virus particles into the actual vaccine supply would be much lower than current practice. I bring this forward because I was worried that an application of this type would trigger a moratorium as requested here, a prohibition as requested here, because it would certainly reprogram the human epigenome. Protecting the environment, again, important. I think everybody is before that. The question is, how do we do that in a way that's practical and agreeable? I was curious to see that, or to not find that the Sierra Club was not, so far as I could tell, a signatory to the document. And that was interesting to me on this point because they have guidelines released for genetically engineered organisms and how they might be handled in the context of environmental release. So I think there are a number of approaches that have been put forward for how to handle environmental release or not. And I don't know, based on what's presented here, whether or not certain things that many people probably intend to do would be absolutely prohibited or attempted to be prohibited. And we need to sort of come to some understanding there before one can figure out what to do about how to regulate it. 5, guarantee right to know and democratic participation. It is really tricky to do with research. The recent kerfluffle around flu research in the Netherlands is a great example of this. And I think everybody's scratching their head about how to do this better. With invention and innovation and research, oftentimes the work is done by an individual, and this is especially true in biology and biotechnology. It may be, going back to some of JD's comments, why one would push for licensing of researchers. But I have a hard time figuring out exactly how I build in a process of full democratic participation in a field of emerging technology that is so close to the invention stage, if you will. There's also a comment about labeling, which I like a lot. I don't buy juice from Guava because they advertise on their label that they don't support GMO, and I don't like that label, so that's very helpful for me. I think equally well that people should label foods that have, engineered DNA within it. But as somebody who at home lives in California, we have in California, as an example, an ongoing ballot initiative, as I understand it, to get labeling of genetically engineered organisms passed in the state. And if you look into the details of that, which I'd like to sign that ballot initiative. But when I look into the details of that ballot initiative, as is typical in much of politics, is bundled with all sorts of other stuff, which I'm against. And so I think it may be that for some of these issues, we need to figure out how to operationalize them in a way that allows for engagement across viewpoints. Let me close with a few comments, maybe one or two comments if I can. A number of years ago, Jim Thomas, one of the lead co-authors on this, as I understand it, and I, reached out to Stuart Brand of the Long Now Foundation and said, could we please do a debate for you in San Francisco on synthetic biology? And the argument we gave Stuart was the following. We said that, this is back around 2008. At this point in time, there is a chance that the second genetic engineering generation, if you will, all of us, whether you're for or against it, as human beings on the planet right now, we're seeing this happen. We might figure out how to do better than what came before, and in particular, to sustain conversation and dialogue across different points of view. And I felt that that event with Stuart's leadership and moderation was really terrific. I don't know how Jim felt about it. But what I've experienced since 2008, and I'm not making more than an observation here, is that many things have raced ahead, and much of the dialogue appears to have gone away or collapsed. And maybe this will just be my closing comment for now. I wonder how we could do better than that, or if that's going to end up being impossible. And are we really on a path where things sort of quickly relax back to a lack of conversation? Hopefully, through the Wilson Center and other things, and this dialogue and what might come from it, a lot more positive engagement is realized. But I have to admit, I don't think that's the default path that any of the groups from all around the table seem to be on.
Okay, Drew, thanks a lot. We'll come back to some of the questions. I'm going to turn it over to Mark and let him go through some of the observations he wants to share.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. This is, I find a very fascinating topic because it's another example of it. I think one of the biggest challenges we have as you think about environmental protection in the 21st century, which is we have these waves of technology coming our way, and they offer a lot of promise. At the same time, we don't quite know how to very quickly think about and address the health, safety, and environment issues that come up. And so I think as a few general observations, in many ways, if you look at this report has elements of it that are very similar to reports that you've seen in the past with biotech, with nanotech. There's a lot of richness to this. I won't try to go through all the recommendations per se, but I want to talk about a couple of themes that run through it. And as a context even more, I wanted to say a couple things about the fact that we need to think about this in a global economy, because we are looking here at these kinds of technologies as technologies that are very valuable. They're going to be cutting edge, make a lot of difference in people's lives, a lot of difference in sustainability at a societal level, and there's going to be a lot of money to be made in this if it is commercialized. And these are the jobs of the future. And there's therefore going to be a huge competition to be at the forefront of these technologies across the world. And the thing that always struck me about these is I thought about nano and also these. This is not a set of technologies that requires you to have special raw materials. I work a lot with the fluorine industry, and there are only 3 places in the world where you can get fluorspar, and therefore that limits the number of actors who can be in the game. That's not true of these materials. I mean, this is bio-based materials. They're all over the place. That's true of a lot of nano. I work a lot with carbon nanotubes. The basic raw materials you can find all over the place. So not only is there going to be competition, but that competition can play out in many parts of the world, and it will. And so that's kind of a context we need to think about here. In terms of recommendations, I wanted to say that there's one here that, of course, I think should be in every one of these types of recommendations. We need a robust government oversight system for these new technologies. Now, I'd like to say that's something we can have in 6 months, but having worked at EPA for many years and watched the development of some of these efforts to really do it right, to evaluate new technologies, it doesn't happen that quickly. I thought I'd just mention a few things that are just important to recognize from our experience with nano in particular. What does the government have to do when it wants to do an oversight system for a new technology like this? Well, the first thing, particularly in this country, you have to sort out jurisdiction among multiple agencies. And that's not unique to the U.S. That's an issue across the world. So you have that. And there's a bunch of fights that have to occur about who's in charge of this and who's in charge of that. But then you have to then figure out what is the regulatory and risk context in which you're going to evaluate materials. What are the exposures you're going to care about? What types of forms of the materials do you care about? And then you have to have some sense of the hazard and environmental endpoints you're going to worry about. Now, the way this happens is that the government has to think about what it knows from other experiences, other analogies, the best available data that they can find, and they have to get some sort of framework in mind about how they're going to think about and review these materials. And then they have to get the best available data in all of those areas so they have a baseline. Because from that, then they have to then figure out what is it they want to know before they approve a new material. So it's the sort of, what's the pre-approval data set that I need to have? And more I've seen situations where they also have to think about, okay, here's what I need to know to decide whether to let this on the market, but there's also some other things I'd like to know, and I want to have a testing program that also specifies that after approval. So that's another set of thoughts. And then you have to think about the risk management issues that are going to work. What are the endpoints that you have? What are risk management measures? Sometimes the criteria about when you say absolutely no versus when you allow it under certain conditions. If so, what are those? And so on and so forth. This takes a while. I've been involved in getting various carbon nanotubes approved by EPA now for about 5 years. It's been about 5 years that EPA has been doing this. I have to say that the EPA program is much better today than it was at the beginning. They've learned a lot. I happen to know they're going to be getting a lot of new waves of information over the next couple of years, and I suspect it's another couple of years before they have what's probably a mature program in place to review carbon nanotubes. And that's just one form of nanotech. So if you think that the government is somewhere in the range of 5 to 7 years to really be able to get up to the point where they can really review these new materials with rigor, the big issue, of course, becomes, well, what do you do in the meantime? What's the interim as these things keep moving towards commerce? In this paper, there's the suggestion of a moratorium. And I appreciate the perspective that reflects. I appreciate the notion of many of us will often have that reaction just viscerally when we think about new technologies like this. But just as an observation, I just don't think that can happen. It certainly can't happen at a global scale. There just isn't enough, there isn't any Uber regulator that's going to impose that. And the market forces here to be at the forefront of this technology will just probably not allow that to happen. And it's not something the U.S. can control, just not the nature of international politics. So I find myself then looking to other experiences to say what would really be useful to do. And a couple that strike me that are worth noting. I do think it's very important to the extent possible to identify an agenda of risk-based research that needs to be done. Watching the nanotech world develop, there is this effort always to corral the tendency of science to take you in a lot of different directions and talk about a strategy. Many of you are familiar with the NNI and the effort to develop a national strategy in the U.S. on research. And as you looked at the first version of that, there wasn't a whole lot in there on health and safety. But because it was a strategy, because it was an effort to systematically think about this, certain pressure points began to develop, and people began to say, why isn't there more in there in environmental safety and health? And I think it has improved, maybe not as much as some would think it should, but it's improving partly because there is the attempt to bring that all together and ask the question, what should be the research? So I think there's a value in those sort of things. The other thing I think it's very important is to capture best practices available. And I think in particular the corporate sector, there is a strong desire with these new technologies to identify various good practices that can work. If you're in a corporate environment, you want to protect your workers. I mean, that is the group that you focus on first. I think the folks have identified the focus on workers makes sense. I think it does. And there's a big corporate interest, I think, in wanting to figure out how to do that well. And there's clearly a very strong economic desire to make sure that you have a credible program in terms of environmental health and safety when you begin to sell products, when you have neighbors, that sort of thing with a new plant. So these are all things that I think you find strong corporate interests in developing. And in the U.S. in particular, maybe less so in other parts of the world, there is the liability issue. You do want to make sure you've thought about best practices, that you're doing what appears to be the best practices around to protect yourself with new technologies. I think it is useful to think about those practices both at the R&D stage as well as the commercialization stage, because one thing I have seen in companies is that whatever practices tend to get established in the lab, especially as you talk about the further steps of research and development, tend to carry through to the more commercial scale operations. So I think that is very valuable. And I think for some of this paper is very good at identifying some of the scenarios of concern. There's the discussion of course, this is a biological material that could release, and they've talked about different kinds of tiering of containment, the physical, the biological, and the geographic. I think I'm not sure exactly how that will work or what the feasibility of some of those measures might be, but it seems to me a good starting point to begin a discussion of what are appropriate best management practices. It's got to be consensus-based. You have to start reaching out to different disciplines, different parts of the regulatory world, the government agencies, of course, but also NGOs and the corporate sector as well. And find a place of neutral ground where people can exchange views and feel that it's an open and a consensus-building kind of organization. I wanted to close then with a few comments on transparency. A couple things that I think can work and some that I'm not sure can. It is very important to emphasize the disclosure of the research that's being done. Of course, there's the publication of journal articles, but there were efforts in the whole nano world to create clearinghouses of information. So you could go to one place and find what is available on the research on these chemicals or this technology. I think that's very useful, and I think would be an addition. The other is to really focus on the issue of how information is characterized in what we call the value chain, from the producers to the processors to the users of the technology. The cutting edge of this is an MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheets. And what is being said about those new technologies and what is known about risk and how that's communicated is a very important thing. I found in the private sector that the MSDS is probably one of the most important environmental documents, even though it was theoretically designed for just worker protection, has huge impacts in how information circulates in the private sector about the safety of materials. And of course, I think that it's mentioned the idea of sharing information with neighbors. The one thing I would observe about that is there's a lot of infrastructure already in place where companies have processes and procedures for doing that. And it is part of being a good neighbor, and you should try to take advantage of that as much as you can. Obviously, it's very different where you're building a new plant in a new place, and people are not only familiar with the technology, but also the company. So that takes a lot more work. But again, there are models for how you can do some of that. Labeling is an issue that I think comes up often when we talk about these kinds of materials, these kinds of potential products. I think there is a real challenge with that, however. I understand that people say, well, I would like to just know what's in there. I think the question is always, what is the message if you say produced through synthetic biology? There's a certain group of people who will say, huh? I don't quite understand what that means. And some people, depending on what it is, might think it is a good thing. I think the question then is what is the message that you want to convey? Is it inherently dangerous or risky? And if so, what does that mean? I mean, it is important, I think, when you talk about consumer labeling, to be clear about a message. What is that you want people to take away from whatever you're putting on a label? I think it was alluded to also that there's this question of public disclosure of information on research. Again, a complex topic, so I'm not clear what the message would be. And to be fair, that's often the cutting edge of confidential business information. And I'm not sure I can see a version of that that wouldn't raise those issues pretty profoundly. So that's one I, again, put a question mark by. But let me stop there, and we can discuss.
Thanks a lot. So I'm assuming there's going to be, hopefully, lots of questions. We've got, well, we're almost done. Well, let's take 5 or 10 minutes at least. Just raise your hands. We'll get you a mic, so make sure everybody can hear each other. And just tell us who you are, where you're from.
Pat Pizzuto, Chemicals Reporter, BNA. These are probably going to sound like very naive questions, but that's my level of knowledge, or lack thereof. One very basic question is, what's the difference between genetically modified and synthetic biology? And another question is, how much of this technology is still in the very, very earliest phase of research, and how much is nearing the market or in the market, even if we don't know that?
You want to try? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can try to tackle those, and Drew might have more to offer, particularly on the definition, because I think there really isn't a set definition of what synthetic biology is. We at least see it largely as an extension of or continuation of current biotechnologies. And so, at least how I try to explain it to my family when they ask me what I do, because they have no clue what I work on. Genetic engineering, you're taking genes from one organism, putting them to another, or synthetic biology, or certain types of synthetic biology involve actually rewriting genetic code on a computer and then putting that new code into an organism. And of course, there's other technologies that are involved, but it's kind of just the next step or the next iteration of biotechnology. It's a continuation, really. But again, there is no set definition, and there's a lot of debate, even within the community and without, of how do you define it, because that's important with how you regulate it. And that's a big question that I think still needs to be resolved. Oftentimes, when, particularly those that are in synbio companies are talking to the public, say, we have this brand new technology, it's going to revolutionize our economy and our world, but then talking to regulators, say, oh, no, it's the same thing, it's just biotechnology, don't worry about it. And then in terms of what's on the market or what's still, I guess, R&D, I think it's from our perspective, it seems like a large portion of the work is still in the lab and it's still research. There are a number of products that are starting to move towards the market, and there are a couple products already on the market. The first would be a bioplastic from DuPont. Sorona, I think, is the actual brand name. It's in some material, like fabrics and things. And then there are a couple, I think, biofuels that have not necessarily on the market, but have at least been being tested and used by the Department of Defense. I think there are one or two, a handful of other products on the market, a couple.
The farnesene developed using Amyris's. Farnesene is an oil, sort of like that grease you have on your head. It's a naturally produced oil that Amyris used its platform to make yeast make more of this instead of ethanol. They like making ethanol. They don't really like making this, so they had to be engineered separately. The Amyris platform is a good example of what you couldn't do through traditional genetic engineering. It's basically a 10-step process that required insertion of a synthetic or a synthesized segment that you couldn't have just taken a gene segment out and got it to work in yeast. So. And they have, they're in the process of getting their malarial drug tested by a Swiss company. Actually, it's licensed to that Swiss company. So you're going to have 3 or 4 products on the market fairly soon.
And then just a number of flavorings and spices are nearing the market. Yeah. Oh. The one synthetic biologist could have helped us with that.
Got a question back.
Other questions? Yeah, hold on a second. We'll get your mic.
So the suggestion of banning efforts to change the human genome and those types of things was mentioned. Is that type of suggestion would that apply to current efforts in like biochemistry to do mutational analysis on proteins that are used in the human body or very close analogs that we do extensive mutational analysis on in order for understanding kind of how our bodies work and in order to inform kind of the pharmaceutical industry on how to better develop medication?
I personally wouldn't see it as applying to that, but when you start using synthetic biology techniques to engineer stem cells to do a new kind of gene transfer in humans, that might well have a heightened likelihood of making making permanent changes in humans. And it's interesting. The synthetic biologists in their papers don't joke, but off the slide in presentations, and some of them have said, and if it happens to permanently change the human, that'd be okay. I think we still have to take those jokes seriously. Very often someone says in an unguarded moment something that they've actually thought about. I think we need to have in place good systems that actually evaluate that. I was not happy when the recombinant DNA advisory committee was pressured really by the pharmaceutical industry not to review sequences shorter than 100 base pair. So we still need review of this, and I think we especially need to put in place a framework that is when we're dealing with things involving changing the human permanently. That's really a modern eugenics experiment. I know we don't like to use those words now, but we need to have transparency. We shouldn't have a situation with synthetic biology that we had with gene transfer experiments where a kid, Jesse Gelsinger, gets killed, and that was the confidential business information. The FDA wasn't going to release it. Finally, the NIH got them to release it, and now they release regularly all the adverse effects and deaths from gene transfer experiments. We need to have that from the start with synthetic biology, not after somebody dies because they shouldn't have been in the program to begin with.
Sarah, we'll get you, Mike. Hold on.
I'm Sarah Carter. I'm a policy analyst at the J. Craig Venter Institute. And actually, I had a sort of a follow-up question, or at least the same topic, but the prohibition is also on the human microbiome, which is the collection of bacteria that exist on the human body and in the human body, in the gut. And I'm wondering if there's a lot of experiments, a lot of science, a lot of research going on right now, just trying to understand the human microbiome and how it relates to disease state. And so there's sort of medical research going on trying to understand if you can change the human microbiome or what sort of therapeutics could be used, including probiotics and yogurt and things like that. And so I'm wondering if the prohibition is synthetic biology specific, or if you would also support a prohibition on altering the human microbiome in any way, or is it just related to the DNA, that actually, if you had a synthetic biology microbe, incorporating that into the human microbiome, or if it's kind of if it's technology specific, or if it's about the human microbiome itself.
Want me to do that? Yeah. Again, I think we're talking about we're not talking about basic research on how that works. But we are talking about, at least at this time, a prohibition against sticking those engineered bugs, whether they're engineered through traditional genetic engineering or through a synthetic biology process, back into humans. I mean, obviously there are medical interventions that we undertake that do change the human all the time, but we really, again, need to take a precautionary approach, and we're viewing the epigenome and the microbiome as an integral part of the human that we don't really understand how it works. Is understanding immunology better important? Absolutely. I have an autoimmune disease. I'm really personally very interested in understanding how those things work. But I don't want us to accidentally make them work badly. Even in gene transfer experiments, our friend Becky McLean was working on a supposedly safe virus. And someone in the lab had an engineered form that she believes harmed her. She won a big lawsuit, not because Pfizer would give her health records, their confidential business information, her health records. Interesting concept. But that they are prohibiting her from talking about it. She won a whistleblower lawsuit, not a damage to herself, because she can't get her own medical records to prove that damage. So, I don't want it to happen to lab workers. I certainly don't want it to happen accidentally to the first handful of humans that are experimented on. Yep.
Hi, I'm a scholar with the Science and Tech program. So JD and Eric, I wanted to ask you what's your point of view about the different recommendations that have been published by the Bioethics Commission almost a year ago, and especially because you mentioned the precautionary principle several times, and actually that's a notion that's a little politically loaded, especially in the US, and it's understood differently in the US and in Europe. And especially one of the vision in Europe is actually that it's not only about prevention, it's also about the benefits of action and the benefits of several research options and the cost of inaction. So it's a difficult principle to handle because it looks at positives and negatives in a way that's not easy to handle in governance. So it's not that far from the prudent vigilance concept developed by the Bioethics Commission. So I just wanted to know what's your view actually on those recommendations?
Well, one of the differences is when you're trying to deal with things that are already in law, the precautionary principle already is in law, is an international treaty. It's not necessarily helpful to come up with a neologism that no one other than the President's counsel has ever used. Or maybe I think the President, the husband of the President's of the Commission had used that in writing before. But prudent vigilance sounds good, but it doesn't actually have a history until now. So I was arguing that, I tried to say that we actually have a pretty good history of different ways of doing the precautionary principle in U.S. law already. Those are difficult enough, but I think we need to be pushing more to actually implement those things we already have in law. And there are several laws that I suggested in my one PowerPoint slide that probably will at some point apply to synthetic biology. If we're going to be tweaking something, we probably should be, tweaking those regulations like OSHA to make sure that they're adequate to protect workers. If precautionary principle is vague, prudent vigilance, has no legal history.
Yeah, let's do one more question, and we'll do many closing remarks.
Colin O'Neill with the Center for Food Safety. Thanks to everyone on the panel. I have a question, I guess, for Drew and Mark, and that would be in the discussion of environmental health and safety data, confidential business information, and claims of CBI get brought up a lot. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts from the industry side and the practitioners of synthetic biology of how you view reforms to CBI claims as they pertain to environment, health, and safety data.
Big topic. I guess I was trying to respond as much as possible to the specific recommendations. All I can tell you is that there's a huge difference between getting information at an R&D stage from a commercial stage. I was just in a set of meetings yesterday about CBI protection with a bunch of interest groups around town. And one of the things that really comes out of, as you listen to people talk about this, is that the R&D stage is the cutting edge of your technology. It's where you create the value of a new product. And for a lot of industries, frankly, after 2 or 3 years, electronics being an example, where the average life of a product is maybe a couple of years, some of the importance of that CBI changes very substantially. So I do think there's an issue of sort of timing in terms of the life of a product about when the information is most sensitive. And R&D is just always the most sensitive. 2 or 3 years out, very different sometimes. It depends on individual industries. Some people are holding on to CBI that's vital to them, the formula for Coca-Cola, that kind of stuff. So it depends on industry, but I do think timing is very important, and that's why the R&D stage is so critical.
Yeah, we've sort of run over, but if Drew, are you still on? We lost him. Okay. I was going to give him a last comment. Anyway, thanks to everyone. Thanks to all the folks on the panel. I'm sure we could stay here and have this discussion. We need to keep the discussion going. I think that's became obvious from the meeting. So let's see if we can sort of arrange follow-on meetings. And I want to thank everyone for showing up. If you've got questions that didn't get answered, please come up and sort of ask people here individually. But thanks to everyone.